The gunshot echoed through the still Nevada air like a death knell as Grace Owens ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs. Blood trickled down her arm where a bullet had grazed her, but she barely felt the sting through the adrenaline coursing through her veins. What had begun as a simple journey to deliver medicine to her ailing father in Pyramid City had turned into a nightmare when the Blackwell Gang ambushed the stagecoach. "We got ourselves a runner, boys," a gravelly voice called out, followed by raucous laughter. "The lady doctor thinks she can outrun bullets." Grace clutched her medical bag tighter against her chest. 6 months of working as the only female physician in Silver Creek, 2 days' ride from here, had earned her respect, but also unwanted attention. The gang had been tracking her for days, she realized now. Not for the meager money she carried, but for something far more valuable in the harsh terrain of 1876 Nevada medical expertise. "Come on out, Doc. We ain't gonna kill ya," another voice called, this one smoother but no less menacing. "Got some boys who need patching up is all." Grace assessed her situation with clinical detachment. 3 men, all armed. The stagecoach driver dead. The other passengers, an elderly couple, had been allowed to continue on foot toward Pyramid City with a warning not to return with help. She was alone, outnumbered, with night approaching in unforgiving territory. "Last chance to come peaceful," the leader warned, his spurs jingling as he circled the wagon. Grace closed her eyes, weighing her options. If she ran, they would shoot her. If she surrendered, she might survive at least until they no longer needed her skills. With a deep breath, she stood slowly, hands raised. "Smart choice, Doc," the leader grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth beneath a scraggly beard. He was tall and lean, with eyes that reminded Grace of a rattlesnake's, cold and unblinking. "I'm Luther. These are my brothers, Sam and Tobias. We got business in Pyramid City and you're coming along." "I'm a doctor, not a hostage," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear threatening to choke her. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins during the attack, and she brushed it from her face with a trembling hand. At 24, she had faced her share of challenges as a female physician, but nothing like this. Luther laughed. "Today you're both. Mount up." Hours later, as dusk settled over the desert landscape, the distant lights of Pyramid City appeared on the horizon like stars fallen to earth. Grace's wrists were raw from the rope binding her to the saddle, and her throat parched from the desert dust and lack of water. The Blackwell brothers had barely spoken during the journey, except to argue about their plans. "The Dry Gulch Saloon will have rooms," Sam, the youngest brother, suggested as they approached the town. "And we can get a drink. Been ridden too long without whiskey." "And what about her?" Tobias jerked his thumb toward Grace. "Can't just walk in with a tied-up woman." Luther considered this, then turned to Grace with a menacing smile. "You're gonna act natural, Doc. We're old friends escorting you to town. Try to signal for help and I'll put a bullet in whoever comes to your aid. Understand?" Grace nodded, her mind racing. Pyramid City was larger than she expected, a growing mining town with wooden sidewalks, a 2-story hotel, several businesses, and at least 2 saloons. People might notice a woman in distress. There might be a sheriff. There might be a chance. As they rode down the main street, Grace tried to memorize every detail: the location of the sheriff's office, dark and apparently empty. The bustling general store, the blacksmith still working despite the late hour. Most activity centered around the Dry Gulch Saloon, where piano music and raucous laughter spilled onto the street along with yellow lamplight. "Remember," Luther warned as they dismounted outside the saloon, "one wrong move and people die." Luther gripped Grace's arm roughly as they entered the saloon, his fingers digging into her flesh through the torn sleeve of her dress. The noise inside momentarily faltered as heads turned toward the newcomers, especially toward Grace. Women were scarce in Pyramid City, and respectable women in saloons even scarcer. The saloon was crowded with miners, cowboys, and gamblers. Smoke hung in a thick cloud near the ceiling, and the smell of whiskey, sweat, and cheap perfume assaulted Grace's senses. A poker game continued in one corner, while a tired-looking woman in a red dress played a slightly out-of-tune piano. "Whiskey," Luther called to the barkeeper, pushing Grace onto a chair at a corner table. "3 glasses, and whatever the lady wants." "Water, please," Grace said, her voice barely audible over the resumed chatter. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anyone who might help her. But the patrons quickly lost interest in the newcomers, returning to their drinks and conversations. Sam leaned close to Luther. "We should get upstairs. Doc can see to Jed's wound, then we plan the bank job." Grace's blood ran cold. So that was their plan, a bank robbery, with her forced to treat their injured accomplice. She had to escape, and soon. A commotion at the bar drew her attention. A tall man with broad shoulders stood with his back to her, his dark hat pulled low. Something about his stance, the quiet confidence, the way others seemed to give him space, made Grace watch him intently. "Ain't seen you around, mister," the barkeeper was saying to him. "Passing through." "Looking for work," the stranger replied, his voice deep but quiet. "Heard the Silver Summit mine was hiring guards. You're a gunman, then?" The barkeeper eyed the holstered pistol at the man's hip. "When necessary." The stranger turned slightly, and Grace caught a glimpse of his profile, strong jaw covered with several days' growth of beard, straight nose, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Luther noticed her attention on the newcomer and grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. "Eyes down, Doc. Don't get any ideas." But it was too late. As if sensing her gaze, the stranger at the bar turned fully, his eyes meeting Grace's across the crowded room. Something passed between them in that moment, a silent communication that made Grace's heart skip. She saw recognition flicker in his expression, not of her personally, but of her situation. The stranger's hand moved imperceptibly toward his gun, but Grace gave a tiny shake of her head. Too many people could get hurt in a shootout. The man paused, then nodded almost imperceptibly before turning back to his drink. "Time to go," Luther announced, finishing his whiskey in one gulp. "Our friend upstairs is waitin' for the doctor's attention." As they stood, Tobias gripped Grace's other arm, and together with Luther, they began steering her toward the back stairs. The fear she had been suppressing threatened to overwhelm her as she realized they were taking her to a private room, where no one would witness whatever happened next. Grace did the only thing she could think of. She stumbled deliberately, falling hard against a nearby table and sending drinks flying. The crash drew every eye in the saloon. "Help me," she cried out, her voice clear and desperate before Luther's hand clamped over her mouth. "Shut your mouth," he hissed in her ear as he yanked her upright. "Our friend is just drunk," he announced loudly to the room. "Can't hold her liquor." Most patrons returned to their drinks with disinterested chuckles, but the stranger at the bar had turned again, his eyes now hard as flint as they fixed on Luther's hand covering Grace's mouth. "That's no way to treat a lady," he said, his voice carrying easily through the now quieter room. He stepped away from the bar, and Grace saw him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with intense eyes that seemed to shift between blue and gray in the lamplight. "Mind your business, mister," Luther warned, his free hand moving to the gun at his hip. "This ain't your concern." "I'm making it my concern," the stranger replied calmly, though Grace could see the tension in his shoulders. Let the lady go." The piano player stopped mid-song, and conversations died as patrons scrambled to move away from what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. Sam and Tobias flanked Luther, both reaching for their weapons. 3 against 1, Sam sneered. Bad odds for a hero. The stranger's mouth curved in something too hard to be a smile. "I've faced worse." What happened next unfolded so quickly that Grace could barely follow the sequence of events. The stranger moved with unexpected speed, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. Sam crumpled with a cry, clutching his shoulder. Before Tobias could fully draw, the stranger's second shot disarmed him, sending his gun clattering across the floor. Luther shoved Grace roughly aside and fired, but his shot went wide as patrons screamed and dived for cover. The stranger rolled behind an overturned table, emerged on one knee and fired twice more. Luther staggered backward, blood blooming on his chest. The brief, violent exchange left the saloon in chaos. Through the smoke and confusion, Grace felt strong hands pulling her to her feet. The stranger's face was inches from hers, his eyes quickly assessing her for injuries. "Can you run?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Grace nodded, still dazed by the sudden violence. "Yes." "Then stay close." He kept his body between her and the wounded Blackwell brothers as he backed toward the door, his gun still trained on Luther, who was leaning against the bar, pressing a hand to his bleeding chest. "This ain't over," Luther rasped, his face contorted with pain and rage. "You're dead, both of you." The stranger didn't respond, instead taking Grace's hand and pulling her quickly through the batwing doors and into the night air. Shouts followed them as they raced down the main street, past surprised onlookers, and toward the livery stable at the edge of town. "My horse is here," the stranger said, leading her inside the dimly lit stable. He quickly saddled a magnificent black stallion while Grace caught her breath, her mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask as he tightened the saddle's cinch. He paused, looking at her directly for the first time since the saloon. In the lantern light, his features were striking, not conventionally handsome, perhaps, but compelling, with a scar that ran along his jawline and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. "Isaac Winters," he said, offering his hand. "Former Texas Ranger." Grace took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm. "Grace Owens, doctor," a shout from outside interrupted their introduction. "They're coming," Isaac said grimly, helping Grace mount the horse before swinging up behind her. "We need to ride." The stallion burst from the stable like a shadow given life, its powerful stride carrying them swiftly through the town and toward the open desert beyond. Grace could hear shouts and the thunder of pursuing hooves, but they faded as Isaac guided the horse into a narrow canyon, following a path that seemed invisible in the moonlight. "How did you know I needed help?" Grace asked when they had put enough distance between themselves and their pursuers that Isaac slowed the horse to a walk. "I didn't," he admitted, "but I know trouble when I see it, and I know the Blackwell Gang. They've been terrorizing settlements from Texas to Nevada for years." "They wanted me to treat one of their wounded," Grace explained, suddenly aware of the warmth of his chest against her back, "and then help them rob the bank in Pyramid City." Isaac nodded, his breath stirring her hair. "They're planning something big. There's been talk. That's why I came to Pyramid City tracking them." "You're still a ranger." A pause. "No, this is personal." Something in his tone told Grace not to press further. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the horses' hooves on the rocky ground and the occasional cry of a night bird. The desert was beautiful under the moonlight, silver and black and utterly vast. "There's a line shack about 2 hours from here," Isaac finally said. We can rest there until morning, figure out our next move." Grace nodded, fatigue suddenly washing over her now that the immediate danger had passed. "Thank you," she said softly, "for what you did back there." His arms tightened slightly around her as he guided the horse around a boulder. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly. "They wouldn't. Most men in that saloon looked away when they saw I was in trouble." Isaac was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe I've seen too many people look away in my time. Decided to stop being one of them." There was history there. Grace sensed painful history. But exhaustion was claiming her, and she found herself leaning back against his solid strength as they continued through the desert night. The stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. The line shack appeared just as Grace was beginning to think she couldn't stay upright in the saddle any longer. It was little more than a one-room structure with a small corral beside it, but it represented safety and rest. Isaac dismounted first, then reached up to help Grace down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with strong hands on her waist. "Easy," he murmured. "We're safe for now." While Isaac tended to his horse, Grace explored the shack. It was basic but serviceable: a small stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves stocked with a few preserved foodstuffs. Someone maintained this place, probably cowboys working the range. Isaac entered a few minutes later, carrying his saddlebags. "It's not much," he said, looking around, "but it'll do for tonight." Grace sank into one of the chairs, suddenly aware of every ache in her body. The graze on her arm had stopped bleeding but stung fiercely now that her adrenaline had faded. Isaac noticed her discomfort. "You're hurt." He knelt beside her, gently examining her arm. "Bullet, just a graze," Grace confirmed. "I have supplies in my medical bag." Her expression fell. "Which is still with the Blackwells." "There's a first aid kit on the shelf," Isaac said, retrieving a small tin box. "Not doctor's supplies, but it'll clean that wound at least." Grace watched as he carefully cleaned the graze with whiskey from a flask in his pocket. His touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such obvious capacity for violence. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint white scar along his jaw, the slight gray at his temples that contrasted with his otherwise dark hair. "How long have you been chasing the Blackwells?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the sting of the alcohol. Isaac's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. 2 years, he said, his voice neutral in a way that suggested he was carefully controlling his emotions. "They raided a settlement near Fort Davis, killed everyone, including my sister and her family." Grace's breath caught. "I'm sorry." Isaac secured a clean bandage around her arm and sat back on his heels. "The Rangers couldn't spare the men for a proper manhunt, said they had bigger problems than 3 outlaws, so I turned in my badge and started tracking them myself. Alone, for 2 years." Grace couldn't imagine such solitary dedication or such grief. Justice doesn't have a time limit. He stood and moved to the stove, lighting it and setting water to boil for coffee. "I almost had them in Tucson 3 months ago, lost their trail in a dust storm. Picked it up again near Carson City last week." Grace watched him move around the small space, efficient and self-contained. "And now," Isaac poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. "Now we figure out how to stay alive until morning. The Blackwells know these parts better than I do, but they're wounded and angry, makes men careless." "Luther was hit badly," Grace said, warming her hands on the cup. "Lung, possibly. He needs a doctor." "He needs a hangman's noose," Isaac replied without heat, "but his injury might buy us time. They'll have to hole up somewhere to tend to him and Sam." Grace sipped the strong, bitter coffee, trying to organize her thoughts. I need to get to my father in Pyramid City. He's ill, that's why I was traveling there. Isaac studied her over the rim of his cup. We can't go back to Pyramid City yet. It's the first place they'll look. But my father will have to wait, Isaac said, not unkindly. One day, maybe two, until we're sure it's safe. Grace wanted to argue but knew he was right. She sighed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. What's your plan, then? Get you somewhere safe, then finish what I started with the Blackwells. The finality in his tone sent a chill through Grace. This man had spent 2 years of his life pursuing vengeance. What would be left of him when it was done? You should rest, Isaac said, breaking into her thoughts. Take the cot. I'll keep watch. Grace was too exhausted to argue. She moved to the narrow cot and lay down, pulling a rough blanket over herself. She expected to lie awake, her mind racing with the events of the day, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. She dreamed of gunfire and galloping horses, of Luther's snake-like eyes and Isaac's steady hands. Sometime in the night, she half woke to find Isaac placing another blanket over her, his movements quiet and careful. Their eyes met briefly in the dim light from the banked stove, and something unspoken passed between them before Grace slipped back into sleep. When she awoke, sunlight was streaming through the single window, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the small space. Isaac stood at the stove, his back to her. He had removed his coat and gun belt, and Grace could see the powerful line of his shoulders beneath his white shirt. You slept, she observed, sitting up and trying to smooth her tangled hair. Isaac glanced over his shoulder. For a few hours, you needed it more. Thank you. Grace stood, wincing at her stiff muscles. For everything. He nodded once, then returned to his cooking. We should move soon. There's a stream out back if you want to wash up. Breakfast in 5 minutes. The cold water of the stream was a shock but welcome, clearing the last cobwebs from Grace's mind. As she splashed her face and tried to make herself somewhat presentable, she considered her situation. She was in the middle of nowhere with a man she barely knew, a dangerous man with a mission of vengeance. And yet she felt safer with him than she had in days. When she returned to the shack, Isaac had laid out a simple breakfast of bacon, hardtack, and coffee. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. We'll head north, Isaac finally said, studying a worn map he had spread on the table. There's a settlement called Willow Creek about 20 miles from here, small, out of the way. You'll be safe there while I deal with the Blackwells. Grace set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. I'm not staying behind. Isaac looked up, surprise evident on his face. This isn't your fight, Dr. Owens. They made it my fight when they took me hostage, Grace countered. Besides, you said yourself that Luther was badly wounded. What if you need a doctor? I'm not planning on giving him medical attention, Isaac said dryly. Grace met his gaze steadily. And if you're the one who needs it, a muscle ticked in Isaac's jaw as he considered her words. It's dangerous. Life is dangerous, Mr. Winters, especially out here. Grace leaned forward. I've spent the last 6 months proving myself in a profession that doesn't welcome women. I've treated gunshot wounds, broken bones, childbirths, and mining accidents. I'm not some delicate flower that will wilt at the first sign of trouble. Isaac studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, a corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. No, I don't suppose you are. They left the line shack an hour later, after carefully removing all traces of their presence. Isaac's black stallion, which he called Shadow, seemed unbothered by carrying 2 riders as they set out across the rocky terrain. You never said how you became a doctor, Isaac remarked as they rode. Can't be an easy path for a woman. Grace smiled slightly, remembering. My father was a doctor in San Francisco. He taught me everything he knew, let me assist with his patients since I was 12. When the medical college in Philadelphia finally admitted women, he sent me east. And your mother died when I was young. Influenza. Grace shifted in the saddle, aware of Isaac's solid presence behind her. My father never remarried. It was just the two of us until I went to school. When I graduated, he decided to move to Nevada for his health, the dry air. He settled in Pyramid City while I took a position in Silver Creek. Must be hard, being on your own in a frontier town. Grace laughed softly. People were skeptical at first. The women came to me readily enough, but the men, well, they needed convincing. The first time I removed a bullet from a cowboy without him dying of infection, they started to come around. Isaac was quiet for a moment. My sister wanted to be a teacher, he said finally. Taught herself to read from the Bible, then taught anyone who would sit still long enough. Elizabeth was her name. The pain in his voice was still raw, even after 2 years. Grace found herself reaching back to place her hand on his where it rested at her waist. She sounds remarkable, she was. His voice was gruff. Had a little boy too, just 5 years old. Grace's heart ached for him. The Blackwells took everything from you. Not everything, Isaac said after a moment. Not yet. They rode in silence after that, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The Nevada landscape stretched around them, harsh and beautiful rocky outcroppings giving way to sagebrush flats, distant mountains shimmering in the heat haze. Around midday, Isaac guided Shadow into a narrow ravine where a trickle of water flowed between rocks. They dismounted to rest and water the horse. We're making good time, Isaac said, surveying the terrain from the mouth of the ravine. Should reach Willow Creek by nightfall. Grace stretched her legs, wincing at the soreness from so many hours in the saddle. And then what? Isaac's expression hardened. I'll leave you there, double back to pick up the Blackwell's trail. And if I still refuse to stay behind, he turned to look at her, exasperation clear on his face. You're stubborn, Dr. Owens. Grace, she corrected. And yes, I've been told that before. Usually by men who think they know better than me what I should do with my life. Something flashed in Isaac's eyes, respect, perhaps, or simply resignation. Grace, then. And I don't presume to know better. I just don't want your death on my conscience. Then don't get me killed, she replied with a small smile. Simple. A sudden gunshot shattered the quiet, the bullet ricocheting off rock inches from Isaac's head. He reacted instantly, tackling Grace to the ground and covering her body with his as more shots followed. Looks like the decision's been made for us, Isaac muttered, drawing his pistol. Stay down. He rolled to the side, taking cover behind a boulder as he returned fire. Grace crawled to Shadow, who was stamping nervously but hadn't bolted. From her position, she could see at least 2 shooters on the ridge above the ravine. Winters. A voice called Luther, sounding weaker than before but no less menacing. Throw out your gun and the woman walks away, so you can shoot me and take her anyway, Isaac called back. Not likely, Luther. Grace's heart pounded as she assessed their situation. They were pinned down, outnumbered, with limited ammunition and only one way out of the ravine forward, directly into the line of fire. Isaac caught her eye across the distance separating them and made a series of quick hand gestures. Grace frowned, not understanding. He tried again, more deliberately, pointing to Shadow, then to her, then to the far end of the ravine. He wanted her to escape on the horse while he provided covering fire. Grace shook her head firmly. She wasn't leaving him behind to face the Blackwells alone. Before either of them could move, a new sound joined the echoing gunfire hoofbeats, many of them, approaching fast from the direction they had been headed. For a moment, Grace feared reinforcements for the Blackwells, but the sudden cessation of gunfire from the ridge suggested otherwise. Riders coming, Sam's voice called urgently. "At least 6. We'll finish this later, Winters," Luther shouted. "Count on it." The sound of retreating horses told Grace that the Blackwells were fleeing rather than face new opponents. Isaac remained in position, gun ready. As the approaching riders came into view at the mouth of the ravine, half a dozen men on horseback, led by a weather-beaten older man with a silver star pinned to his vest. "Nevada Rangers," the leader called. "Identify yourselves." Isaac lowered his weapon slowly, stepping into view with his free hand raised. "Isaac Winters, former Texas Ranger. The lady is Dr. Grace Owens. We're being pursued by the Blackwell Gang." The leader studied them for a long moment, then holstered his weapon and dismounted. "Marshal James Harker, Nevada Territory Rangers. We've been tracking the Blackwells since they hit a stagecoach outside Carson City last week." He nodded to Grace. "You their latest victim, madam?" "They ambushed my stagecoach yesterday," Grace confirmed, stepping forward. "Mr. Winters rescued me from them in Pyramid City last night." Harker's bushy eyebrows rose as he looked at Isaac with new interest. "You took on the Blackwells alone, either very brave or very foolish." "Both, likely," Isaac admitted. "Luther and Sam are wounded. They can't have gone far." "My men will pick up their trail," Harker said, gesturing to 2 of his rangers. "You folks look like you could use a safe place to rest. Willow Creek's not far. We maintain a station there." Grace and Isaac exchanged a glance. "That was our destination," Grace said. "I need to get word to my father in Pyramid City that I'm safe." "We can arrange that," Harker assured her. "But first, let's get you both to safety. The Blackwells aren't the type to give up easily." As they rode with the Rangers toward Willow Creek, Grace found herself missing the closeness of riding with Isaac. He rode beside her now on a horse borrowed from one of the Rangers, occasionally glancing her way as if to reassure himself of her safety. "Your timing was fortunate, Marshal," Isaac remarked as they traveled. "What brought you to that particular ravine?" Harker shrugged. "Been tracking the Blackwells for days. Lost their trail after a dust storm, then picked it up again heading toward Pyramid City. We were circling wide to cut them off when we heard the gunfire." He gave Isaac a shrewd look. "You've been after them a while yourself, I gather." 2 years, Isaac confirmed quietly. Harker nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Personal then?" "Very." The marshal didn't press further. "Well, Mr. Winters, I appreciate your efforts, but the Blackwells are now officially Ranger business. We'll take it from here." Grace saw Isaac's jaw tighten, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew he wouldn't simply walk away, not after coming so close to the men who had destroyed his family. Whatever happened next, Isaac would be part of it with or without the Rangers' blessing. Willow Creek turned out to be little more than a cluster of buildings around a natural spring, a general store, a small church, a few houses, and the ranger station. It was nowhere near the size of Pyramid City, but to Grace's tired eyes, it looked like heaven. The ranger station was a solid log structure with a bunkhouse attached. Harker showed Grace to a small but clean room normally used by the station cook, who was away visiting family. "It's not much," the marshal apologized, "but it's private and safe." "It's perfect," Grace assured him. "Thank you." After Harker left, Grace sank onto the narrow bed, the events of the past 2 days finally catching up with her. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until now, when the immediate danger had passed. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her boots. A soft knock at the door roused her from near sleep. "Yes, it's Isaac," came the quiet response. "May I come in?" Grace sat up, smoothing her hair. "Yes, of course." Isaac entered, looking as tired as she felt. He had washed the dust from his face and hands, and someone had given him a clean shirt. It transformed him somehow, making him look younger and less hardened. "Marshal Harker sent a rider to Pyramid City," he said, standing just inside the doorway. "Your father should know you're safe by morning." "Thank you." Grace studied his face, seeing the conflict there. "You're not staying, are you?" Isaac sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I can't. The Blackwells are still out there. Harker's men are good, but they don't know Luther like I do. He's wounded and cornered now, more dangerous than ever. And you think you have to be the one to bring him in? It wasn't a question. I've come too far to stop now." His eyes met hers, and Grace saw the determination there, but also something else, regret, perhaps. "Then I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Isaac shook his head. "No, you'll be safe here. Once the Blackwells are dealt with, you can return to Pyramid City. And if you're injured, if Luther or Sam gets a lucky shot—" Grace stood, crossing the small room to stand before him. "You need a doctor with you." "Grace," Isaac began, but she cut him off. "I'm not asking permission, Mr. Winters." She tilted her chin up defiantly. "I'm informing you of my decision." For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. Then, unexpectedly, Isaac smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face and crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You really are the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said, his voice warm with what might have been admiration. "I prefer determined," Grace replied, returning his smile. "Now, when do we leave?" Isaac's smile faded. "First light, before Harker and his men wake up. They'd try to stop us." Grace nodded. "I'll be ready." Isaac hesitated, then reached out slowly as if giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, lingering for just a moment against her cheek. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." After he left, Grace touched her cheek where his fingers had been, a curious warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. In the midst of danger and pursuit, something unexpected was growing between them, something she wasn't sure either of them was prepared for. True to his word, Isaac was waiting with saddled horses when Grace slipped out of the ranger station before dawn. He had left a note for Marshal Harker explaining their absence, though Grace suspected the ranger would be less than pleased when he found it. "Ready?" Isaac asked quietly, handing her the reins to a sturdy bay mare. Grace nodded, mounting quickly. She had changed into clothes borrowed from the station, a simple shirt, vest, and riding skirt that would allow her to ride astride more comfortably. A borrowed medical kit was secured to her saddle. They rode out of Willow Creek as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, heading southwest toward a range of low mountains where Isaac believed the Blackwells might have taken refuge. "There's an abandoned mining camp in those hills," he explained as they rode. "Copper played out 10 years ago. Perfect place for wounded men to hide." "How did you know about it?" Grace asked. "Studied every map of this territory I could find over the past 2 years," Isaac replied. "Marked every ghost town, abandoned mine, and lined shack where outlaws might hole up." Grace was impressed by his thoroughness. "Your ranger training, partly, mostly just determination," he glanced at her. "Luther Blackwell has escaped justice too many times. Not again, not this time." They rode steadily through the morning, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and hardtack. Isaac was quieter than usual, his mind clearly on the confrontation ahead. Grace respected his focus, keeping her own counsel as they traveled deeper into increasingly rugged terrain. By mid-afternoon, they had entered the foothills of the mountain range. Isaac led them along game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding the main paths where they might be spotted. His woodcraft was impressive. He read the land like a book, noting broken twigs, disturbed rocks, or other subtle signs of recent passage. There, he said finally, pointing to a thin wisp of smoke rising above a stand of stunted pine trees. Someone's there. They dismounted, securing their horses in a sheltered hollow. Isaac checked his weapons, a Winchester rifle in addition to his Colt revolver, while Grace organized her medical supplies, not knowing what she might need. "Stay behind me," Isaac instructed as they began to move cautiously through the trees. "If shooting starts, find cover immediately. Don't try to help me until it's clear." Grace nodded, her throat suddenly dry with apprehension. The reality of what they were doing, confronting dangerous killers, was sinking in now that the moment was at hand. They crept forward through the underbrush, moving silently toward the source of the smoke. Gradually, the remains of the mining camp came into view, a cluster of decaying wooden structures surrounding a central clearing. A lean-to had been constructed against one of the more intact buildings, and beneath it, Grace could make out two figures. Isaac motioned for her to stay put, then moved to a better vantage point. Grace watched as he studied the camp, noting the positions of the men, looking for any sign of others who might be hidden from view. When he returned to her side, his expression was grim. "It's them, Luther and Sam." "No sign of Tobias or anyone else. Luther looks bad, fever probably, infection setting in from his wound." "He needs a doctor," Grace said automatically. Isaac's jaw tightened. "He needs a judge, but we'll take him alive if possible, let him hang for what he's done." He outlined his plan quickly, simple and direct. He would approach openly from one direction, keeping their attention while Grace circled around behind them. If they surrendered, she would treat Luther's wounds. If not, "Be careful," Grace said softly as Isaac prepared to move into position. "Please." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken in his eyes. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly to hers, a kiss that was over almost before it began, but that sent electricity coursing through Grace's body. "For luck," he murmured, then was gone, moving silently through the trees. Grace touched her fingers to her lips, stunned by the unexpected gesture and her powerful reaction to it. Then, gathering her courage, she began making her way carefully around the perimeter of the camp as planned. From her new position, she could see Sam tending to his brother. Luther lay on a makeshift bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. Sam looked little better, exhausted, his wounded shoulder crudely bandaged, his movements slow with pain and fatigue. "Blackwell." Isaac's voice rang out from the opposite side of the clearing. "It's over," Sam whirled, grabbing for his gun while Luther struggled to sit up, reaching weakly for a rifle propped against a crate. "Show yourself, Winters," Sam shouted, his voice cracking with strain. Isaac stepped into view at the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed steadily at Sam. "Drop the gun, both of you, you're done." "Done," Luther wheezed, a terrible smile spreading across his fever-flushed face. "Not quite," he raised his voice. "Now, Tobias." Grace had only a moment to register the danger before a strong arm wrapped around her from behind, pulling her roughly to her feet. Cold metal pressed against her temple. "Look what I found skulking around," Tobias Blackwell called out, dragging Grace into the open. "Drop your gun, Ranger, or the lady doctor gets a third eye." Isaac's face went utterly still, his knuckles white on his rifle. "Let her go, Tobias. This is between us." "No, it ain't," Sam snarled. "It's between you and all of us. You killed our brother Jed back in Texas. Been hunting us ever since." Grace's mind raced. Jed, another Blackwell brother she hadn't known about, the one Isaac had killed, sparking this long pursuit. "Your brother murdered my sister and her family," Isaac said, his voice cold. "I was just the law doing its job." "And now you ain't the law no more," Luther laughed, the sound ending in a racking cough. "Just a man with a grudge. No different from us. Tobias tightened his grip on Grace, making her wince. Put down the gun or she dies now. Grace met Isaac's eyes across the clearing, willing him to understand what she was about to do. Then, summoning all her strength, she slammed her heel down on Tobias's foot and drove her elbow hard into his stomach. His grip loosened just enough for Grace to twist away, throwing herself to the ground as Isaac's rifle cracked. Tobias screamed, clutching his shoulder where Isaac's bullet had struck. Sam fired wildly, missing Isaac, who had already dived for cover behind a water trough. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Grace crawled frantically toward the shelter of a ruined shed, bullets kicking up dirt around her. She heard Isaac shout her name, the fear in his voice spurring her to move faster. Reaching the shed, she pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she could see Luther struggling to his feet, using his rifle as a crutch. Despite his weakened state, he was dragging himself toward Isaac's position, murder in his eyes. Without thinking, Grace burst from her shelter, racing toward Luther. He turned at the sound of her approach, raising his rifle too late as she crashed into him, sending them both sprawling to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. Luther, despite his fever and wounds, was still stronger than Grace. He grabbed her by the throat, his face contorted with rage as he squeezed. Black spots danced before her eyes as she clawed at his hands. The thunder of a gunshot seemed distant to her oxygen-deprived brain. Suddenly, Luther's grip went slack, his eyes widening in surprise. He toppled sideways, revealing Isaac standing behind him, his revolver still smoking. Grace, Isaac was at her side in an instant, helping her sit up as she gasped for air. "Are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak yet, her throat burning. Isaac's eyes were wild with fear as he examined her, his hands gentle but urgent. "Sam and Tobias," she managed to rasp. "Wounded but alive," Isaac said grimly. "It's over." And it was. Luther Blackwell lay dead, while his brothers were disarmed and secured. Isaac had accomplished what he had set out to do 2 years ago, brought justice to the men who had destroyed his family. Grace expected to see triumph in his face, or at least satisfaction. Instead, as he helped her to her feet, she saw only relief that she was alive, that they had both survived. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did you do that?" Grace touched his face gently, feeling the stubble beneath her fingers. "Because you needed to end this, and I needed to help you do it." Something broke in Isaac, then the dam of emotion he had held back for so long. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he might never let go. Grace clung to him just as tightly, the shared danger and relief binding them together in ways words could not express. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured against her hair. "I'm still here," she whispered. "We both are." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Marshal Harker and his rangers rode into the clearing, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. "Looks like you two decided to handle things yourselves," Harker observed dryly as he dismounted, "despite my clear instructions to the contrary." Isaac kept one arm around Grace's shoulders as they faced the marshal. "Sorry about that. Old habits." Harker surveyed the Blackwell brothers, one dead, 2 wounded but alive. "Can't argue with the results, I suppose." He nodded to Grace. "Doctor, I believe Sam and Tobias could use your attention if you're willing. We need them alive for trial." Grace nodded, moving reluctantly from Isaac's embrace to attend to the wounded outlaws. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Isaac watching her, his eyes never leaving her for long. The journey back to Pyramid City took 2 days. Sam and Tobias Blackwell rode under heavy guard, their wounds treated enough to keep them alive, but in considerable discomfort. a situation Marshall Harker seemed to find appropriate given their crimes. Isaac rode beside Grace, the two of them often falling into comfortable conversation or equally comfortable silence. The tension of pursuit had lifted, replaced by a new awareness of each other and the possibilities that now stretched before them. "What will you do now?" Grace asked on the second evening as they sat by the campfire a little apart from the Rangers. "Now that it's over," Isaac gazed into the flames, considering. "I'm not sure. Been chasing the Blackwells so long I haven't thought much beyond catching them." "Will you go back to Texas?" "Rejoin the Rangers?" He shook his head slowly. "No, that life is behind me now." His eyes met hers, warm in the firelight. "What about you? Back to Silver Creek after you see your father?" Grace thought about the small practice she had built there, the patients who depended on her. "I don't know. My father needs me now, and Pyramid City doesn't have a doctor." "So you might stay there?" Isaac asked, something hopeful in his voice. "I might," she said softly, "if I had a good reason to." His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. No more words were needed that night. Pyramid City welcomed them as heroes the next day. Word of the Blackwells' capture had spread, and townspeople lined the main street, cheering as the Rangers escorted their prisoners to the jail. Grace's father, Thomas Owens, was waiting anxiously on the porch of the modest house he had purchased near the edge of town. "Grace!" he cried, embracing her tightly despite his frail condition. He was thinner than she remembered, his once robust frame diminished by illness, but his eyes were bright with joy at seeing her safe. "When I heard what happened with the stagecoach, I feared the worst." "I'm fine, Father," she assured him, returning his embrace. "Thanks to Isaac." Thomas Owens turned to Isaac, extending a trembling hand. "Mr. Winters, I understand I owe you my daughter's life." Isaac shook the offered hand gently. "She saved mine as well, sir. Your daughter is one of the bravest people I've ever met." Grace's father invited Isaac to stay for dinner, and to Grace's delight, he accepted. As the three of them sat around the small dining table, Grace observed the easy way Isaac interacted with her father, respectful but not deferential, listening with genuine interest to Thomas's stories of his medical practice in San Francisco. "Pyramid City needs a good doctor," Thomas remarked, glancing meaningfully at his daughter. "My health won't allow me to practice anymore, and the nearest physician is 2 days' ride." "I've been thinking about that," Grace admitted. "Silver Creek has been good experience, but perhaps it's time for a change," her father suggested gently. Grace nodded, her eyes meeting Isaac's across the table. "Perhaps it is." Later that evening, after her father had retired for the night, Grace and Isaac walked slowly through the quiet streets of Pyramid City. The town was settling down after the excitement of the day, though light and music still spilled from the saloons. "Your father is a good man," Isaac said as they strolled. "I can see where you get your strength." Grace smiled, touched by the compliment. "He sacrificed a lot to send me to medical school. Worked extra hours, took on additional patients. He never doubted I could be a doctor even when everyone else did. He was right." Isaac stopped walking, turning to face her. "You're an extraordinary doctor, Grace, and an extraordinary woman." The way he looked at her made Grace's heart race. "What happens now, Isaac?" she asked quietly. "With us?" He took her hands in his expression serious. "I've spent 2 years living for vengeance. I don't want to live that way anymore." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I want to build something, a future, and I'd like to build it with you if you'll have me." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple sincerity of his words. "I'd like that too," she whispered. "Very much." Isaac drew her closer, one hand gently cupping her cheek. This time when he kissed her, there was no urgency, no danger nipping at their heels, just the sweet promise of what could be. Grace melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she returned his kiss with all the emotion that had been building since that first moment in the Dry Gulch Saloon. When they finally parted, both breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Never thought I'd find happiness again after what happened." "Sometimes life surprises us," Grace said softly, remembering how differently things might have turned out if Isaac hadn't been in that saloon, if he hadn't fought his way through the crowd to carry her to safety. "Marshal Harker offered me a position with the Nevada Rangers," Isaac said. "Based here in Pyramid City." Grace's eyes widened. "Are you going to take it?" "I'm considering it. Been wearing a badge most of my adult life, not sure what else I'd do." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "What do you think?" "I think Pyramid City could use both a good doctor and a good lawman," Grace replied with a smile. "Especially if they happen to be married to each other." Isaac's breath caught. "Grace Owens, are you proposing to me?" She laughed, the sound bright in the quiet night. "I believe I am, Isaac Winters. Someone has to take charge after all." His answering smile was brighter than the stars overhead. "Then my answer is yes, 1,000 times yes." 3 months later, Grace stood before the small church in Pyramid City, her hand resting on her father's arm as they prepared to walk down the aisle. Through the open door, she could see Isaac waiting for her at the altar, handsome in a new black suit, his badge gleaming on his chest. The past months had been busy ones. Grace had established her medical practice in town, quickly gaining the trust and respect of the community. Isaac had taken to his role as deputy marshal with the same dedication he had shown as a Texas Ranger, though Grace noticed a difference in him, a lightness that hadn't been there before, as if the weight of vengeance had finally lifted from his shoulders. "Ready, my dear?" her father asked, patting her hand. His health had improved under her care, though he would never be robust again. "More than ready," Grace replied, adjusting her simple white dress one last time. As they walked down the aisle, past the smiling faces of townspeople who had become friends and patients, Grace's eyes remained fixed on Isaac. His expression as he watched her approach was one of such love and wonder that it nearly took her breath away. Marshal Harker stood beside Isaac as his best man, and Grace's friend Sarah, the school teacher who had arrived in town just weeks after Grace, served as her maid of honor. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear. "I, Isaac James Winters, take you, Grace Eleanor Owens, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Isaac said, his voice strong and sure as he slipped a gold band onto her finger. "I promise to love, honor, and protect you, to be your partner and your friend in good times and bad, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live." When Grace repeated her vows, she saw tears gleaming in Isaac's eyes, this man who had faced down outlaws without flinching, moved to emotion by her promise of love. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac drew her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their commitment and brought cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterwards spilled into the town square, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. As the newly married couple swayed together beneath lanterns strung between the trees, Grace laid her head on Isaac's shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "Happy, Mrs. Winters," Isaac murmured against her hair. "Completely, Mr. Winters," she replied, lifting her face for a kiss. "Though I'll still be Dr. Owens professionally." "Wouldn't have it any other way," he assured her with a smile. "Pyramid City needs its doctor just as much as it needs its deputy marshal." As darkness fell and the festivities continued around them, Grace thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, a chance encounter, in a crowded saloon that had changed both their lives forever. What had begun with danger and desperation had transformed into something beautiful and lasting. Isaac seemed to follow her thoughts. "Do you ever think about that night in the dry gulch?" he asked quietly. "How different things might have been if I hadn't walked in when I did." Grace tightened her arms around him. "I try not to, but I'm grateful every day that you did." "I wasn't looking for you," Isaac admitted. "But somehow I found you anyway, and carried me to safety," Grace added, remembering his strong arms around her as they fled the saloon. "My hero." Isaac chuckled, spinning her gently in time to the music. "Who saved whom, I wonder? You gave me back my future, Grace, a reason to live beyond vengeance." As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the community that had embraced them both, Grace knew they had found something rare and precious, a love born in danger, but built to last through whatever life might bring them. Together, they would heal the wounds of the past and forge a future filled with purpose and joy. The former Texas Ranger and the Lady Doctor, an unlikely pair brought together by fate and bound by love in the wild heart of Nevada, where danger and opportunity walked hand in hand, and second chances waited for those brave enough to seize them. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of their home on the outskirts of Pyramid City, watching as Isaac taught their 4-year-old son Thomas to ride his new pony. Their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth sat on a blanket nearby, carefully arranging a collection of smooth stones with the same concentration Grace brought to her medical work. Pyramid City had grown considerably in the past 5 years, fueled by a new silver strike in the nearby mountains. The single main street had expanded to 3, with new businesses opening regularly. Grace's medical practice had grown as well. She now employed a young assistant, a woman who had traveled west specifically to study with the increasingly well-known Dr. Owens. Isaac had been promoted to full marshal after Harker's retirement 2 years earlier. He ran the town with a firm but fair hand, respected by even those who occasionally found themselves on the wrong side of the law. "Mama, look," Thomas called excitedly as he completed a circle of the corral without his father's steadying hand. "I'm riding all by myself." "Wonderful, sweetheart," Grace called back, her heart swelling with pride and love. Thomas had Isaac's dark hair and her green eyes, while little Elizabeth was her father's daughter through and through, from her serious expressions to her uncanny ability to observe everything around her. Isaac lifted Thomas from the pony, setting him on his shoulders as they approached the porch. "We have a natural horseman here," he announced proudly. "Takes after his mother." Grace raised an eyebrow. "I believe you're the former ranger in this family." "And who was it that outpaced the Blackwells on horseback while wounded?" Isaac countered, setting Thomas down to run to his sister. "We make a good team," Grace conceded, leaning into her husband's embrace as he joined her on the porch. "The best," Isaac agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always have." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a violent confrontation in a crowded saloon to this peaceful moment with their children. Life in the West was still challenging, still dangerous at times, but they faced it together, their love a constant in an ever-changing world. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked, his arm warm around her waist. Grace smiled up at him, seeing the same love in his eyes that had been there on their wedding day. "Just how fortunate we are, and how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best things in life." Isaac nodded, understanding immediately. "From that day in the dry gulch to this, quite a story, isn't it?" "Our story," Grace said softly. "And it's only just beginning." As their children played in the yard and the town of Pyramid City settled into evening behind them, Grace and Isaac Winters stood together on the porch of the home they had built, their shared past behind them and their future stretching ahead, as vast and promising as the Nevada sky.